There's been more and more attention focused lately on how the government can do things in a consistent way instead of everybody making up their own approach as they go. Now, for several years we've had the US CERT, the Computer Emergency Response Team, that's where all the data is reported on vulnerabilities and breaches and threats. And that group, which is government run, collaborates very closely with similar groups in the private and academic sector. So the good answer is there's lots of sources. The bad answer is there's lots of sources. So there's a lot of things to do to stay current now. In the modern age, you can subscribe to RSS feeds, you can subscribe to news alerts. Nobody has much of an excuse for not being aware of threats that have actually been published in some way because there is so much information out there. And then the hard part is actually figuring out which of those things are really relevant to you. And in some cases, that's a role that needs to be formally defined within the Security Program Office. The number one answer is to follow the law. It changes all the time. The number one law that everybody looks to in the federal government is the Federal Information Security Management Act, which sets the standards and the requirements for what the security program needs to do. But when you start to get down deeper as to what types of systems you have, what types of data you're working with, there's all sorts of regulations out there. So first thing you need to do is talk with your legal counsel, because at the end of the day, that's usually what you're required to do. Now, there's a lot of explicit guidance that comes out of OMB and some of the other government agencies at the executive level that tries to help you figure out what you should do from a best practices standpoint. But in terms of requirements, really it's all right there in the law. Now, some of that's subject to interpretation. There's a lot of subjectivity in security. So the other approach you can do there is to make sure you have a really good handle on your risk management. Understanding what the risks are to your own organization, your own risk tolerance, because every organization is different, and making sure that the decisions you make about what security you put in place is adequate to address your own comfort level with the risks that you face. This is a big one for the federal government, probably the biggest weakness the government has right now, because what the requirements like FISMA give you are the controls that you're supposed to put in place. They're what you should do. But there's very little out there that says, well, how am I doing with that? So we see year after year agency FISMA scores go up, but in the last 2 years, intrusions in the federal government have tripled. So which one of those is really the right story? Are we getting better or are we getting worse? So there's really no shortcut to doing more field testing, actually testing what's already been deployed in production and how it's working. That means penetration testing, that means white hat or black hat teams where you hire somebody to come outside and just see if they can break into your organization, and that means doing really, really consistent vulnerability scanning in your organization, not waiting for every 3 years when you have to authorize your systems to operate. Both the commercial sector and the government sector have lots of control frameworks, lots of best practices and standards. Governments are set by FISMA. The most popular framework in the commercial sector is the International Standards Organization framework, the 27000 series. It tells you what controls you should put in place based on what you're trying to do, and they're very high on risk management and all those things. So we have common ground there. What the commercial sector tends to be very good at is not wasting money. Is thinking about what the risk is to their organization, what the impact would be if something bad happened, a disclosure, data theft, something like that, putting that in dollar terms and saying, you know what, if we're going to lose $100,000, let's not spend $1 million to plug the hole. Government's not quite so good at that, and sometimes they're not able to be. There's certain things the government just has to do because the government has to do them. You know, in some cases, like the VA data breach, the worst thing that happened there really was the bad publicity, right? Lots of things happened, lots of new procedures were put in place after that happened. But at the end of the day, there wasn't a big financial loss to the VA, right? And they did a little bit of credit monitoring for some people, and then they realized the data wasn't really used for any nefarious purposes, and everybody decided it was just okay. Let's be better about it in the future. So what the commercial sector, I think, can learn from the government is it's really, really helpful to apply a consistent set of standards. You know, I mentioned the ISO standards that some commercial sector entities use, but not everybody does. Unless you're in the financial services sector, the healthcare sector, where there's very explicit security laws that apply to you, a lot of people roll their own. And that's not always a good thing when you're trying to look at consistent approaches to security. So having a consistent control framework and consistent practices that go with it can really do a lot to make sure that we don't have these massive disparities in how secure one organization is versus another. Breaches of personally identifiable information is a big one right now. The Recovery Act that just passed put all sorts of new requirements on organizations that have to publicly disclose their breaches. There's new financial penalties. There's things that people really want to avoid in terms of the bad publicity and the hit to the bottom line that can happen if you have a breach. The number one thing people can do is be more aware of what your information is. Having a really good inventory of what information you hold, what your data is, where it is, who's responsible for it, and how sensitive it is. You'd be surprised how many organizations don't actually know that. If you actually know what your assets are in terms of your data, it's a lot easier to put the appropriate protections in place. Number one, encryption. Encrypt data in transit, encrypt data at rest, encrypt data when it's not being used. And that way, if it is stolen, a tape falls off the back of a truck that was made from a backup, or a laptop is stolen when an employee is traveling, you don't have the risk that you would have if the data is exposed in the clear. But the number one thing is to understand what the data is. The other piece is make sure the people who touch the data, your employees, actually know what they're supposed to do. Policies are big in this, what people should do, but also awareness training so people know what the right practices are. The third thing is putting controls in place, which really goes back to encryption. Employees want to follow good procedures. Nobody wants to put their company at risk, but sometimes people don't make the right decisions. They leave the laptop in their car, they don't pay attention when they're doing something in a public environment, they connect to a hotspot in Starbucks, any number of those things. So you have to put some technical controls in place to sort of make sure that people don't inadvertently violate the policies that you put in place to protect the data.